Hey guys, welcome back to the production example for Beginner's Guide for XGen. So in the last kind of part of this, we've had two videos so far. We had the beginning lesson and then we had the kind of real-time work. I think it was an hour and a half long in the end. And the result of both of those is that we've got our fundamental groom blocked out at this point. We've got our parting in place, we've got our guide work working for us, we've got the density, the width, enough stuff in general to have the hair feeling about right from like this sort of distance. And obviously that's kind of a key aspect is when you're working, you want to work on the biggest things first, which is one of the reasons I always suggest you do your parting map before you do any clumping. There is another technical reason for that, but I'll get into that in a moment. But yeah, so this is how our groom looks right now. There are some very mild issues with it, but it's beyond something you need to worry about. Things like the hair passing through itself here, you might see the highlight being broke up by other hairs, but that sort of stuff disappears the moment that you do any kind of clumping and noise. It just vanishes, so we don't really need to worry about that. And in general, this is cleaner than what you'd normally require. And as I said in the previous video, like I normally kind of do all this stuff side by side, but for the sake of a lesson and showing you what to look for, I'm finding it easier to kind of teach that by separating everything out. But yeah, so this is where we're currently at. So from here, there's quite a few things we could obviously do. There's a ton of work, but the primary thing that we want to do, or primary things we want to do, sorry, our identity map. So now we've got a mask, but that is only one map. Generally speaking, it's easier to control a groom if you've got two maps, one that defines where your hair goes and then another map that defines how much hair is in that area. That's generally a lot easier to paint than having it all done in one map, which you can also do if you want to. The next thing is clumping, which is the most important modifier and one of the fundamental parts of grooming. So we'll be covering that in a fair bit of depth. And then we've got noise and cut modifiers, which are much more of a detailing type phase. So if we take a quick look at our reference, I'll talk over clumping for a moment. So obviously our hair at the moment is very simplistic, given that it's got no structure to it, it's just the general forms. And clumping it's where all the hairs get pulled together. This can be down to damage, wetness, greasiness. There's a million reasons for stuff to clump. Fundamentally, if you're struggling to kind of see clumps, just be aware there's multiple layers of them. So normally you need at least two clump modifiers, sometimes three. I very rarely see a case where you need more than three modifiers. But yeah, so looking for clumps, like this guy is obviously the most obvious. So you got these huge triangle shapes at the front. A general tip I can give to kind of spot where the clumps are or how big they are is look for the shadowing. Generally speaking, hair that isn't very clumped will have very uniform shadows. So if we look at an area like the back of the head here, the shadows are very minuscule, and if they are there, they're like a hair wide. So looking for shadows can kind of help you, give you an idea as to where the clumps are. Like if we just move up a little bit, there's no defined triangle shapes that you normally look for when you're clumping, but there are these big, like kind of round shadows that are happening everywhere. So that shows that the hair in general is clumping together. It's just kind of broken up a little bit. But this sort of stuff is helpful to look for. And then obviously you've got stuff like this where it's like super broken up and you can actually see the triangles that the clumping causes. So if you want like a proper technical breakdown of like how clumping works in XGen, feel free to go back to the clumping lesson. For this one, we're just going to do the production example. And then we've got obviously many other examples of clumping. These are a bit more extreme than what I want to go for. Generally, I think what I want to go for is more like one of these two. So we'll kind of, experiment with that and I'll show you kind of my workflow. But yeah, so let's start creating some modifiers. So I'm just going to go into the modifier tab just up here in the XGen window, click on add, and then go to clumping. So when you do this, you'll probably get an error at the bottom, big red line. Don't worry about that. That's just part of kind of creating a clump modifier. The reason it didn't happen to me is because in the previous video, we created a basic clumping just to check how our guides were working, because clumping is very helpful for doing your guides. And so we have our clumping in scene, but obviously nothing happens and you'll be getting an error. So when we go into set up maps, just hit generate. What this will do is create points where our hairs will clump around. So fundamentally, these are just generating another groom. So where each one of these points is, another kind of hair comes from. And then the closest hairs to that will clump to it, and you get like a lot of control that way. One thing you'll notice is that you've got this region map area down here, or control maps. One of the many reasons, and this is the technical reason, that I like to do region maps before clumping is because if you don't, when you create a clumping modifier, it won't find a region map, which is fine. But then if you add one later, you need to manually add this in. So creating your clump modifier after you've done your region map means that it automatically links itself up. It just makes your life a lot easier. You don't have to find these, you don't have to connect them up properly. It's all just done for you. So we're just going to hit OK with the default settings and just see how that looks. And let's just update that. So this is our kind of default clumping. So depending on exactly what we want to go for, this might actually be okay for like the front area. But we've got quite a lot of controls as to how we actually play about with it. So we can change the clump profile, and I'm going to set this to update automatically. So we can change the clump profile to make it a little bit less clumped at the root. And that will allow it to kind of blend in more and only clump towards the ends. Now obviously this level of clumping, in my opinion, is a little bit too big. So I'm going to decrease the size of this. To do that, we just go back and set maps. And I'm going to increase the density here. So I'm going to set this to, let's say, 2 and hit save on that. So this feels a little bit better. However, one of the issues we've got now is that this feels incredibly uniform. Like it's the exact same shapes everywhere. So if we go back and set maps, there is actually a little tool for this, which is this mask here. You can create a map for this, and this is fundamentally a density change for this. It kind of multiplies it. The way this works, though, is quite interesting. So the density, no matter what you set your mask to, this density is generated. So when I hit generate, every single time it's going to make 2. And then it checks the mask. And that might sound a little bit backwards, but here's how that's actually quite helpful. What it does is it checks every hair and then says, okay, well, the mask is 1, so I'll keep all of them. If you then set this to, like, let's say 0.6 and generate again, you'll notice that now we've got some big gaps starting to appear. So like this gap here, and there's some that are still close together. So the way that this works is it generates your hair at this full density and then deletes kind of at random. I'm pretty sure it is random. And it will delete, in this case, 40% of the hairs because we've gone from 0 to, we've gone from 1 to 0.6. So that's a 40% change. So roughly 40% of the hairs are gone now. So we end up with these gaps. So this is actually a really good tool for variation. I personally don't like to push it this far normally. I normally stop at about 0.8. But you can go all the way down to 0.1 if you want to and generate that. And now it's like really random, which this could be good for very kind of manky and matted fur. But this is just something you can kind of be aware of. So if you want a little bit of variation for free, I normally like to set this to about 0.8 and hit generate. And that just means that there's some areas where these are more spaced out, which means the clumps in those areas are slightly bigger. So you just get a little bit of size variation. As I said, though, you can plug a map into this if you want to. No problem with doing that. I just generally prefer not to. One other thing that I've not mentioned so far is this guide button here. So what this does is it generates a clump at the base of every hair, or it generates a clump at the base of every guide. Now, there are some artists that like to use this. I'm personally in the camp of thinking this is not a good tool. The reason I think that is because generally speaking, humans are pretty bad at making stuff look natural. There are definitely people who can, but guide clumping almost never feels natural. It just never has the right, and feel is just the best word. It's obviously down to the skill of the artist and how they like to work, but I generally recommend against using guide unless you've got a very specific shape that you need to get. But generally my approach is add more guide to define it, then use more natural procedural clumping. And that just gets me a look that I feel like is hard to imitate with guide clumping. But that's up to you. If you want to do that, that's perfectly fine. I will quickly show you how that looks. And it goes without saying, if you're doing guide clumping, you need to use a lot of guides. So as I said, we're not going to use them, but it's worth being aware of. So I'm just going to hit save on this guy with the generated clumps, and that'll give me something like this. So for some areas, this might already be enough. So for the top, this is roughly right. It might be a little bit boring at the moment, like a little bit flat, but we can do quite a lot to play with that. I'm going to remove this extra point. So we could add noise, we can do a lot of stuff, but just to kind of block stuff out, I'm going to move on to adding my second clumping. So as I said earlier, generally clumping is in multiple layers. There's the error that you'll normally get when you create a clump map. But yeah, so there's normally multiple layers of clumping. So if we go back to our reference again, at the front here, you can see how there's one big clump. It's like a huge rectangle, this like highlighted section. But within that, you can see more clumps. You can see these like shadows appearing. So that's subclumping. XGen makes that super easy. It's just a case of creating another modifier and make it denser. Now, the order of these modifiers does matter. The one on the bottom should always be the densest. Or, sorry, the least dense. So, the largest clumps in this case. So, when we got to clump 2, generally speaking, what I recommend is you get the density of your previous one, which in our case was 2, and then you multiply that by like 3 or 4. So I'm going to set this to, it was 2 before, so I'm going to set it to 8. And I'm also going to plug in that same kind of value in the mask. So let's go 0.8 and hit generate. Now the control map here is automatically sorted for us because we've already got a clumping modifier. Again, if it detects something that it should be using, it will automatically plug it in. I'm just going to hit enter on that. And there we go. So now we're starting to get our subclumps. We can control these clumps individually, so we can add a really tight base to these smaller clumps, which sometimes I like to do. It depends on the look of hair that you're going for. And we can add noises. All this stuff was covered in the kind of clump lesson. So I'm going to ignore that now for though. So I'm going to turn this guy off, and we need to start looking into doing clump masks. So the mask will be used to kind of turn off the clumping in areas where we don't want it to be. So this clumping right now might look okay for like the top, but in these areas where the hair gets a lot shorter, it looks really bad. And that's because, generally speaking, here's a general tip I like to give. The size of the clumps is normally pretty closely related to the length of the hair. Longer hair will be more able to form larger clumps, just because the hairs can physically reach further. So in areas where the hair gets shorter, generally the clumps get smaller. And you could do that with a clump density map, but generally I prefer to have a subclumping which is painted more in the small areas than the large clumping. So we're just going to go into this. So clump 1, which is our large clumps, mask. I'm just going to hit create map. And then in here, I'm just going to call this one fur head 01. And let's call this clump 01 mask. So I've just put C01 just to save me typing the word clump. You can do that if you want to, or you don't have to. But this is very clear naming. We know exactly what groom it's for, we know what clumping system it's for, and we know what it's doing to that clumping system. Map resolution of 5 will work just fine for this. Clump maps generally don't need that much detail for a blockout. And so we're just going to hit create. So we're immediately going to get the issue of not actually being able to see our map, and that's just because the head is visible. So I'm just going to go in here, make the head invisible, and then just hit this paint tool again and go into the tool options. So as always, I like to paint quite blocky values. I generally find this is an easier workflow for me. It's up to you how you do it. So I'm just going to turn off solids pressure. You can use a soft brush if you want to. The reason I like to use solid brushes is because clumping generally feels quite strange if you do mid-tone values, like if you do it everywhere anyway. So not all clumps end in a square. So I like to do kind of really broken up maps rather than gray maps. So I'm just going to hide the groom and show the guides. And the guides are just a visual reference for me that don't get in the way. So we're just going to turn off the kind of clumping towards the bottom. I'm also going to turn on reflection just so I don't have to paint everything twice. And we're just going to paint black in the areas where we don't want the clumping anymore. So I'm going to take this up to about here. And for the sake of this video, we won't really go much further than this for the maps. Like, we're just going to block them out. Let's go up to there. We can break the symmetry later as well in the full length video. So let's just test that. I'm going to hit save textures just to make sure we've saved our image. And we'll just go to save the PTEX. And you'll see now how we no longer have clumping in the areas where the map's painted off, whereas where the map is painted in, we get the clumping. So we've got a little bit leaking in here. I'm fine with that, to be honest. We'd have to check our reference to exactly where all the stuff goes. But again, when I'm blocking out a groom, I like to just do block colors, get everything in place, and then tweak it. Because you can spend forever tweaking one map, and then when you add the next clumping, it destroys it anyway. So try to not spend too long on your maps on their first pass. Just get everything in place and then continue from there. So next one is our clumping 2. So we can just add this in, see how that looks. That might actually be okay as it is. I might reduce it in some areas. So let's just quickly check our reference. So we will want to reduce the clumping towards the bottom and the back of the neck as well, although our hair is a little bit longer than this reference. But we may still want to reduce that. It's like if we look at this guy, it is there, but I think it would be helpful to reduce it a little bit, just in some areas. So I'm just going to move that over, and we're going to do the same thing again. We're going to create a map. This one will be for head 01, C02, clump 02. mask. Starting with white again, that's absolutely fine. Immediately breaks our clumping because there's no p-text map available yet, and that's fine. Let's create this. And I'm just going to paint black. I'm only going to paint very small patches because this clumping we want to be effective in more places. I'm also just going to just do something like that. So we'll see how this looks. This might look awful. We'll find out later. I guess that's the kind of a key thing to mention here is like the first time you block something out, it's not necessarily going to work. Just test it. And then if it doesn't work, you can always undo it. So let's do that. So that's a little bit better to me. We can obviously go in and refine that more, but I'll save that for the next video just because we want to get everything in place here and then we'll refine it for those who want to watch the very long refinement process. So that gives us our general look. So this actually is surprisingly far along now. So if we show our head and hide our guides, this is now starting to feel a lot more real. It's obviously nowhere near like a photoreal groom, but it's starting to get there, and that's kind of the key. We can try changing our clump 1 density. So one thing to be aware of is when you change a clump modifier below the others, you do have to update the ones above them. But I'll explain that more as we do this. So if I go to U and set this like 1.5 and generate that and hit save, that just makes those top clumps a bit bigger. However, the clump 2, if we go to set maps, you'll notice it's got like the control mask and the control map from our clumping 1. So anytime that you change your clumping 1, this would need to change, but it doesn't automatically do that because it's not regenerated anything, it's not resaved it. This control map is fundamentally a region map for your clumps. Each clump has a unique like region or ID or whatever the correct term is. Honestly, it doesn't really matter. A control region is fine. But it will still look for the old regions. So we just have to go in here and hit save. And you'll see our hair very slightly moved. Now the clumps are a bit more defined, and that's because the hairs have been pulled into the correct clumps again. So just be aware of that. Whenever you change the density of one layer of clumping, you need to change the density of the layers above it. So we got to this point. We can obviously keep pushing further on the clumping. I'm going to mostly leave it alone for now. Let's go into adding a cut modifier. So let's go to cut and set that in. So this is a really nice node in that it automatically puts an expression here. However, the expression isn't really the one that I like to use. So random is fine. But the problem is that this is based on world space. So if your hair is really, really long, this is only cutting from 0 to 0.2 centimeters. So if your hair is like a meter long, you won't see a difference. If your hair is on a mouse, you see a huge difference. So the easiest way to change that is to multiply this by $C length. And what that does now is it looks at the length of the hair. So like hair down here is like, 1 centimeter, let's say, and hair up here is 15 centimeters. And it multiplies this value by that length, which now means that a value of 1 in the cut, no matter how long the hair is, will cut it all the way down to the root. A value of 0.2 will remove 20% of the hair's length, no matter how long it is. So we can set this now to be a little bit more sparse, and that will kind of soften up the edges of everything. Generally, I find that quite high cut values are quite soft looking. If you want hair that feels a bit more solid, a little bit more greasy, generally a little bit less of this cut will help. So normally a normal value for me is around 0.3, 0.2, at most 0.4, unless I'm doing very fluffy hair. But a little bit cut goes a long way. If we just add that, remove it, it just softens up the tips of the clumps, makes it feel a little bit less perfect, which in the world of CG is the most important thing. Make things feel less perfect. So it's a very subtle effect, I will give you that. Like if you're doing very clumped hair, you're barely going to see it at all. Once we break up these clumps, we'll start to see it a little bit more. In fact, down here would be a good place to see it. So you see how it's just adding a bit more length variation. Breaks up that line. But yeah, so we've got our cut. We're just going to add 2 noises now. So let's go in and we'll create our first noise. So noises are, the way I think of them is they are drying the hair. So you want this to be pretty, it, again, depends on your reference, but you want it to be pretty high frequency and very subtle, just to kind of make the hair slightly looser. And again, this isn't based on length at all. So these short hairs get really noisy, but the long hairs don't get very noisy at all. So we can just go into the magnitude and multiply that by $C length. And that will obviously make everything frizzy now, but now it's uniformly frizzy. So we can set this back down to a normal value. And it looks like it's the same kind of fur quality and everything. That's not necessarily what you want, the same fur quality and everything, but it is kind of helpful to have. So I'm just going to increase that root scraggle a little bit. And then let's find a value that works, because we want this to be subtle. We don't want to destroy our clumps. And that's one of the key aspects of doing your noise, is you don't want to immediately destroy all your clumps with that noise. I think something like this is decent. We just need to add a little bit of randomness to this, which further will help us get our clumps back. So 0.1 is a value that works quite well. So I'm just going to create a rand from, let's go from 0 to 0.2, which, if you notice, the middle point of those two values is around 0.1, like is in it's 0.1 either side. So we hit enter on that, and we keep the same general look, but now we've got some hairs that are frizzier and some hairs that aren't frizzy at all. So that will feel just a little bit nicer. It feels a little bit dry, which is what we want in this case. And we can change the frequency of that, although I think the frequency of 1 might actually be working okay for us. So let's try setting that to like 2. Higher frequencies is going to make it feel more frizzy. If we set this down to like 0.1, it looks like it's got less noise, but actually it's got the same amount of noise. It's just not pulling it apart the same way. I'm just going to check my viewport settings, anti-aliasing. I'm just going to turn this up a little bit. That just makes the hair a little bit cleaner, so we can see it. It's not actually changing the hair shape, it just makes the viewport a bit better. And I'm going to add a little bit of ambient occlusion as well. So I think a little bit more frequency would be good. There is no magic number for this sort of stuff, so if you're hoping that, you know, entering the same values that I'm entering right now on your grooms will like kind of save whatever modifier you've got, it won't. Just experiment with the values. If you want more kind of bends in the hair, just increase the frequency. If you want the bends to be bigger, increase the magnitude. And you don't necessarily have to use the C-length thing. I just find it helps quite a lot. So we've got a general noise in place now, which is obviously very uniform. We've not painted any maps, but that is okay for now. So next thing is to add strays. So we're going to create a new noise modifier, and then we're going to load the expression that I've made. So load other, I'm going to go into expressions and select, where is it, percentage affected. Again, this is one of the nodes that I'll give you guys. So one of the expressions, sorry, I'll give you guys in the tutorial pack. So don't worry about that. I'm going to set this to a reasonable amount of strays. So let's go like 7%. That might be a little bit high. We'll find out. I'm just going to crank the magnitude. And the reason I'm putting it way up is because I generally find that most beginner grooms really underestimate the strays. Now, granted, it very much depends on reference, and these are way too frizzy. But you want to make sure that you kind of don't just have like 1 or 2. Like, there's a lot more strays in most people's hair than you expect there to be. If we consult our reference, you can see how there's like almost a layer of hairs that are just sitting off. These are pretty low res, so maybe like these would be more helpful. This guy's hair is pretty lacking in strays, but even then you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Some are bigger than others, but you got, you know, quite a lot in this small region. We can see 14 hairs, and that's just the ones we can actually see. There's probably a lot more than that. So I'll drag that back over. And I'm going to lower the frequency, because that frequency is far too high for what we want. I even have to lower it further than that. Let's go to 0.2. Something like that works pretty well for me. We'll want a little bit of randomness, and again, the length of the hair isn't considered. So these hairs down here are getting completely kind of pulled out. The hairs up here, a bit, you know, they're getting moved, but nowhere near, relatively speaking, as much. So I'm going to multiply that. And this is going to look crazy now, just because all the hair is longer than 1. There we go. And let's pull that down to 1. I think a lower value still, so let's go with 0.8. That's starting to work for me now. It's still a bit crazy, but we are going to pull it down from here with a randomness. So let's replace that randomness. And I'm going to go from 0.4 to, let's go to 1. So some of the hairs are a lot more extreme. And that visibly will kind of, in a way, reduce the amount of strays visually, because the strays that you notice are the ones that stick out the furthest. So as we kind of pull some of these back in the hair, you're not going to notice them as much, but they are still there. Granted, these are far too strong and far too many, so I'm going to reduce that density down, or that percentage affected down. And I am going to lower that 1 because that is still too extreme. So let's go to 0.7. That looks a lot better. Another thing I like to do is in the magnitude scale, strays tend to sit out of the hair quite a lot, so we can just do something like that. And that will just kind of go in and help pull the hairs apart, really. So like you get a lot more of this, whereas without these points, it kind of sits in more at the front. So something like this will feel a little bit better for general strays. Like a pretty normal setup will look a lot better with this. Another type of stray that you can get, and something that I've only recently started adding in my grooms, is you can get quite a lot of strays where only the tip is coming out. So you just see like this random hair sticking out. That's something that's really easy to do. So we're going to create another noise modifier. And this one, we're going to set up pretty much the exact same way we just did. So I'm going to set that percentage affected, set this to a very low number, set this to $C length, and then set the frequency. I'm going to set the frequency very low, so it's barely doing anything. And what we can do is just grab this magnitude scale and slide that, so only the tip, is being affected. So we're going to want to increase that frequency a bit. And what that'll do is just pull the tips of the hairs out. Oh. So then we can just lower that magnitude. And you'll see how this noise is just grabbing some hairs. So let's get an angle like this. It just grabs some hairs and pulls the tips out. And that can feel quite nice. It again adds to that drying feeling of hair. So something like this is starting to get there. I am going to remove the noises temporarily, just so I can kind of really work on the clumping for a bit. Because the next stage really for us to start adding more variation to the clumps. So a little bit of noise, nothing too major. I generally like to keep this subtle and work more with guides. But let's just go to our clumping modifier. We can go down to our noise effect. And I'm just going to set this to 1 and turn this up at the tip. So, oh, we don't want to do that. So if I set this back to 0, it's a pretty subtle effect. So let's say it's like 10. We'll start to see what that's doing now. So obviously this is a very strong effect. Noise frequency set to 0 by default. Not really sure why. So let's go 0.4. That is way too strong. 0.2. I think that amount of frequency looks interesting. So let's just get that noise magnitude, which in this case is just called noise. Set it down to a lower value. Again, turn it off. So let's go rand 1 to 3. Now let's get a little bit more variation in there. It'll break up a little bit the clumping work, a little bit of the guide work we did, but in this case that's what we want. Our guides are very simple. We can change the noise scale to add a little bit more towards tips. And I'm going to move that frequency a little bit. So one thing you can do is if you feel like this is too chaotic, but you want more noise, which I know that sounds like a weird thing, but sometimes you want more noise, but you don't want it to feel more chaotic. The easiest way to do that is with noise correlation. So this is a percentage. We can set this up to 100. And if I do that, I can set this to 10. And the hairs kind of move with each other. So with this frequency, it doesn't really work. But it just helps the hairs. Like if I set this correlation lower, it feels a lot more chaotic. So this can be a helpful feature to add. I'm just going to put that back in. Rand 1, 2, 4, I think it was. Frequency good. And I'm going to set noise correlation to about 50. And that just helps kind of make the hairs flow together a little bit better. It's a very subtle effect, but it is there. We can also slightly reduce the effect on the tips if we just want to kind of bend the hair around it. But that's a very optional thing to do. I am going to increase that tip a little bit. So it's starting to get there. Obviously, the large clumps are going to be the more subtle noise-wise. So I'm going to step it down a little bit further. And now let's do the same for our small clumps. So our small clumps are going to be more noticeable just because there's more of them. So noise here is going to be quite subtle. I set that to 1. So that already starts to get something. Obviously with a frequency of 0, it's not overly helpful. So let's set that to 0.4. It's a little bit too strong for my taste, but it's starting to get something quite interesting in these areas where it really pulls the hairs apart. I'm going to step it down a little bit and go to noise correlation, add a little bit of that. And then let's get some randomness in there. So rand 0.5, so let's go 1.2. There we go. So we're already getting towards the 30-minute mark, so I'm going to end this lesson after I do the density. So density I was talking about earlier. If we hide the head, currently the hairline is perfectly sharp, and that's for two reasons. One is that our mask is painted as a sharp line. Two is because there's no fade, like it goes purely, pure black, no hair, to pure white, which is full hair, which isn't really how hair works. Normally there's a lot more breakup than that, and generally what a lot of people do is they blur their mask. Now, I'm not too keen on that, just because I find it hard to control. If you want to move your hairline, you have to repaint the density every time. So what I generally prefer to do is a separate mask, or two masks. You get a density and you get a actual mask itself. So what we can do to do that is go into the expression editor where this mask is, and we will find that $A equals map, and then the path to our mask and what it's doing. Let's copy paste this and put it on the line below. So I'm going to rename this dollar to mask, and then I'm going to rename this dollar to density. And then the first thing I do before I click anything, I want to make sure that I change the name of this map to density. So this is going to break immediately, and I'm fully expecting that. So let's just hit apply. Yep. So our hair disappears, and that's because we've got our mask, we've got a density, but then we're using $A, which doesn't exist. So what we want to do is just type $mask, which may not appear yet. No, it doesn't appear yet, so we need to go out of this and go back into it. So let's go $mask, there we go. And now we can do a multiply by $density. Now hit apply again. We're going to have no hair again, and the reason we're going to have no hair, well, we have this, but that's more of a kind of debugging thing as far as I'm aware. So the reason we don't have anything here is because our mask is set 0 to 1, but then our density map doesn't actually exist yet. Like, we've created it, but we never painted it, we never did anything with it. So I'm just going to hit apply and accept, and then we're going to go to our density map and just hit the paint tool. So this is now set to 0.5. If we just hit save, we get our hair back. And that's because our map is painted to 0.5, which actually sometimes is helpful to do. We could just set this to 0.5 and then double this density. And we're back to what we were before. One reason it can be good to do that is because if you need an area that's more dense and you've already painted white, you can't do it. So it is quite a good technique sometimes to paint or to fill 0.5 and then paint up and down from there. So let's just hide that. So what we're going to want to do now is paint our hairline to be darker. So I'm going to go in with a soft brush in this case, or even a textured brush. So let's look for a nice texture. I think frost is normally a nice one. Yeah, frost and foliage normally look quite good. So we can go in with this, set that to black. And then I'm just going to paint, luckily because our guides are positioned at the hairline, we can just paint like this. So we just get a little bit of breakup. It's nothing major. And you will spend a lot of time tweaking these maps to get them to look good. But we're just going to rush through it. So you don't have to worry too much about filling black in areas, because again, the mask is going to take care of the areas where we don't want hair. And then this just takes care of like reducing the density. So we could even paint this at like 0.25 instead of 0, but I generally like to paint like this. So we got a basic map. We're just going to save the texture, so we got it backed up, and then save the ptex. And now what we'll find is that the hair kind of fades in more. Like you see how there's like a layer where the hair's thinner and then it thickens up back to the normal hair. And down here where we painted it mostly down, it's massively reduced. So that can be quite helpful to do. And yeah, it makes a surprisingly big difference. So the last thing for us to do now is to do our render for, well, technically final render for the project. And we will be continuing kind of groom work in the next video. So we'll be going over the kind of more refinement end of working on clumps, noise, and a little bit density work, and probably quite a lot of guide work. But in the meantime, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye, guys.